Hey guys, welcome back. This week we're going to talk about depth psychology and why it is a superior approach when compared with cognitive behavioral therapy. Although it's not a perfect approach, so towards the end of this video we're going to talk about how to make depth psychology even more perfect than it is. It's true. Depth psychology is a superior approach when compared with cognitive behavioral therapy, although you wouldn't know it by looking at the psychology industry, the psychology field, the industry maybe that it's become. Everybody's going in the CBT direction or derivatives thereof. Positive psychology, short-term focus, evidence-based therapy, motivational interviewing. There's a bunch of different kinds of cognitive behavioral therapy, but all of it's based on the premise of cognitive behavioral therapy. First though, what's the difference between depth psychology and CBT? I guess the best way to describe it would be to give an example. Now, if you have an issue, let's say you're triggered by something in your environment. Your mom calls you and it bothers you when she calls you for whatever reason. It doesn't matter. You go to a cognitive behavioral therapist, they'll just tell you, well, what could you do to change your state that you're in when your mom calls you? How could you reduce the triggering that is caused by your mom calling you? A depth psychologist would go, well, what is going on beneath the surface? How do we fix that leads to you being triggered by your mom calling you? Now, maybe it's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference. And this is something that I've struggled with throughout my tenure as a psychologist, even before I went to graduate school for psychology when I was 18, 19, 20. Even probably as young as 15, I was reading books about psychology. At first I was reading books simply about therapy because I thought they were great books about communication and how do you get through to somebody who doesn't seem to want to listen. I thought they were great for that, and reading scripts through successful therapy sessions, unsuccessful ones, and seeing what I can learn from that. But after that I got into reading Jung and Freud, which were the starters of depth psychology, understanding that there is this unconscious that may be in control. And if you want to change the triggering event, we got to look at a deeper issue. We have to look at the depth of your mind. So I just took that as gospel. And yeah, Freud and Jung, they knew what they were talking about. So depth psychology seemed to be it. However, when I went to graduate school, the first graduate school I attended wasn't even cognitive behavioral therapy in its direction. It was actually took a more Rogerian approach. That's what we learned in therapy intervention. Universal client acceptance. I was about to say universal basic income. That's not it. Unconditional positive regard for your client. That's what I learned originally. Maybe not that well. But even in this environment where it was not explicitly CBT, implicitly, it was kind of taught to us that CBT was the best way to conduct therapy. So I kind of looked at Freud and Jung and I thought, well, these ideas are great, but look, all the evidence points to cognitive behavioral therapy working better. But then something else happened. I got more into the research. I actually read more about cognitive behavioral therapy and what the effect really was. I read more about depth psychology, what the effect really was, and I read even more about the studies that supposedly compared cognitive behavioral therapy and depth psychology on equal footing. And I found out, wait a minute, cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't work. It only worked in the short term and in a certain context. If you want to go to a long-term solution to any sort of personality or neurotic disorder that you have, it seems to be depth psychology. So why is this? Why is depth psychology superior? Well, for starters, depth psychology actually looks at the causes of the neurotic symptoms of the personality disorder. It doesn't just look at the surface. It looks at what's underneath. What is the ultimate cause? If you just work on the symptoms, it doesn't really get rid of the sickness. Like you can take Benadryl or some other, flu medication, and you can stop the runny nose, but that doesn't stop the cold. Now, cognitive behavioral therapists would say, well, if we change the behavior, if you have a thought that you don't like and we change that thought, that will, if we stick with that consistently enough, that will in turn change the neurosis, that will in turn change the deeper cause. Unfortunately, this doesn't really work with humans. This works with dogs. This is how dog training works. You change the behavior in the dog and it fixes the personality disorder in the dog. But this isn't how it works with humans. We are conceptual beings and dogs are not. So it's a little bit more complicated. You can't just change the cause by changing the effect. And the research bears this out. Well, I guess we're getting to the research. Yeah. Another other reason that depth psychology is superior is because it is actually based in the evidence. Now, when you see the term evidence-based now, that's synonymous for CBT or derivations thereof, positive psychology, motivational interviewing, all the ones that I said before. There's a bunch of acronyms now. That is synonymous for CBT. However, none of the evidence really bears it out. CBT only works in the short term and it only works in a specific context. So you could go into a therapist, a cognitive behavioral therapist, and tell them, I get triggered when my mom called. And the therapist could be able to give you a bunch of techniques to use so you're less bothered by your mom. And it can totally work in that one instance. But let's say, most of the reason why your mom is bothering you is because you have latent anger and hostility issues. And until you work on the latent anger and hostility issues and what's causing that, and it may have nothing to do with your mom, until you work on that, then something else is going to trigger you. Something else is going to trigger you. Yeah, you fixed the situation with your mom, but that was one effect, that was one symptom of the deeper illness. And here I mean illness in a metaphorical sense. I don't mean it's a literal sense. That gets confused a lot in the mental health field. But no, it's not a literal illness. It is a metaphoric illness. But it is maybe helpful to think of it as an illness. However, in depth psychology, it may take a little bit longer. But see, we don't even know if that's true. I got into looking at a lot of the research that compares CBT and depth psychology, and it was not compared on equal footing. In fact, a lot of these studies that supposedly showed that depth psychology did not work as well as CBT, the practitioners who carried out the depth psychology interventions weren't that well trained in it. They only trained in it for a couple hours, and they came from the CBT paradigm. Sorry for using that word paradigm. They came from the CBT viewpoint. So they were less likely to carry out the depth psychology intervention in perhaps a more productive, hard way. So that's another reason why depth psychology is superior. And the third reason, there's a bunch of reasons. These are three main ones. And the third reason is the philosophy behind depth psychology is way more based in reality. We need to understand, this is something that we do not learn in graduate school as burgeoning practitioners. We don't learn that any sort of psychological intervention that we do learn is based in philosophy. It is all based in philosophy. And if we're going to be committed to this psychological intervention, we have to first be committed to the philosophy. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy is based in Stoicism. And while there are, there's a lot of books now praising Stoicism. If you actually read those books, they don't actually praise Stoicism, they praise some guy's 21st century interpretation of what Stoicism is. If you look at Stoicism as a philosophy, I'm not going to get into it now, but there are a lot of bankrupt concepts in Stoicism, and I'll just point out one in particular, is the mind-body dichotomy. We think that Christianity really solidified the mind-body dichotomy in Western thought, but it was only Christianity as influenced by Stoicism. And what this means, well, this goes back to the cause and effect symptoms and real illness. It means that there are deeper parts of us. In a psychological context, we'll call them emotional parts that may be influencing us outside of our control. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy accepts one side of the mind-body dichotomy. The top-down will change the thought, and that'll change the emotion, and that'll change the behavior, but they don't accept the other side of the mind-body dichotomy as well. These emotions, these behaviors could have a reason all of their own. They could have motivations all of their own. And until you speak to those motivations, then you're going to keep having the maladaptive thought, the effect of the deeper cause. And not the other reason, Stoicism It was invented by the Greeks to disengage from the world because they saw their civilization crumbling to the, at the time, much more powerful, growing Roman Empire. So this is a philosophy for not really living on this earth. It's a philosophy for disengaging from the earth. And that is effectively what happens in cognitive behavioral therapy. You disengage from the neurosis. So it may seem to work in the short term, but in the long term, it doesn't really work that well. But the one good thing with cognitive behavioral therapy, the one advantage that it has on depth psychology is there is a methodology. There is a precise way for doing the intervention based on the philosophy of cognitive behavioral therapy. However debunked or however terrible that philosophy may be, at least there is an intervention and there's a methodology. Now that is something that depth psychology lacks. But that's what we're working on here at Animus Empire. I think we are beginning to develop. It may not be perfect, but we're beginning to develop a methodology for working with depth psychology. It comes down to creating a structure for your emotions. There is a specific way your emotions work and how, emotions can seem very disparate and disconnected, but I think they are all connected by a few fundamental premises. Now, we all experience the emotions different. Each one of our experiences that informs the emotion that maybe cause certain emotions to happen, that's all different. So I'm not saying we're all the same, but I do think there are certain laws, there are certain principles of emotions and how they work, specifically how they tie with our decisions, that using this structure of the unconscious can form a specific methodology for depth psychology. And this is what we're working on here. And I think it's really important. I will end it there. If you want to learn more about this, read my ebook. It's all available on the site, animusempire.com. Just click at the store if you want to learn more about the therapy that I do. animusempire.com/therapy. We also have a group. We also have a course that explains the exact methodology, the exact intervention that you will need to go through to get the most out of therapy. And that's another thing. If you work with the methodology enough, you see that there's ultimately one goal for therapy for everybody. Now, it looks maybe a little bit different in different situations, but there is one general abstract goal. And that's what we teach in the course, animusempire.com/course. And yeah, I will definitely leave it there for now. If you guys have any questions, put them in the comments, like and subscribe. But I think if we're going to move therapy in a new direction, in a new, more stable direction, we need to integrate the conceptualization of depth psychology with the pragmatism of CBT.